as I was saying, I think there are two main points that this special interest by neuroscience about habits, two kind of fields that are necessary just to consider. The first one is the general frame of consideration of habits, because it's, as you can imagine, neuroscience, the originality of neuroscience is just a kind of putting together of many biological approaches, and that is claiming for a multidisciplinary view on the same object, the same subject in this case, and this that is habits. Well, that is the first point, no? The kind of frame of consideration. The second point is the interpretation of data. How do you interpret, to what extent, what is the limit of interpretation of those data? As you know, neuroscience today is claiming not only to understand the structures and the dynamism of biology, but also to understand just the human behavior, to explain human behavior in a very complex way. So the question is, to what extent can neuroscience explain human behavior? Should it arrive to psychology, for instance? Should it arrive to sociology? Should it arrive to philosophy? So those questions are really very pregnant and very present today. And I think both of those questions, the frame and the interpretation of the data, are claiming for a philosophical understanding and dialogue with neuroscience. Well, this is a general introduction to make you arrive to my point. That is that in ancient times, Aristotle, as well as nowadays, was a philosopher who had this concern about putting together a philosophical approach, so to say, reflective approach, and also a biological approach to human being. He didn't separate them. Separation is a kind of Renaissance point of view that took place in history, and since then we have had this kind of distance between philosophy and science, but in ancient times was not so. Well, Aristotle had this kind of concern about human biology to understand the whole human being. The second approach I wanted just to compare with Aristotle is the approach of American pragmatism. And the reason for that is that American pragmatism also is very much concerned about biology. But I will show you that despite the similarities with Aristotle, there are strong differences which make them quite distant approaches concretely to habits. So let us begin first with Aristotle. Very likely, the first one to deal with habit in a very precise way was Plato, but was perfected by Aristotle. So the systematicity in Aristotle is for sure superior to that of Plato, that was quite not very systematic. And Aristotle had different approaches to habits. He had a metaphysical one, he had a logical one, and he had a very well-known ethical one, moral approach to habit. And so we can say that there are many meanings of the idea of habit, that is in Greek hexis, and but among all those meanings, there is one that is above other ones, that is the idea of disposition, diathesis. A habit is mostly a disposition. What does it mean, a disposition? Well, disposition is an idea that put together three concepts. The idea of having something, the possession, the idea of becoming or being something, so the idea of being, and the idea of acting, so producing some kind of action. So possession, being, and action are all together in the idea of disposition. There are many kinds of disposition, also an immediate disposition to something. To some extent, also passions could be considered or affective states could be considered some kind of dispositions. But the real difference with habits is that habits are stable, and are not stable because they last in time. They are stable also because we can control them. They come from within. They are modifying our behavior from within. And that's why we can direct and keep them throughout time. Well, to understand this idea of habit in Aristotle, I will underline three main approaches of Aristotle, which are very important for this stake. The first approach is the distinction and the unity that Aristotle establishes between soul and body. It's very well known. I'm not going to extend myself on this, but I want just to underline something. For Aristotle, the real being is the unity, so the composite, right? Actually, he thinks that they are separate forms. This is not the issue now, but they are very special. The ordinary being, and we can say the true being, is the being composed by form and matter. In the case of a living being, of a being that is alive, we speak about soul and body. Well, that is well known, and as I am saying, but what is important is the idea that the priority of soul over body. Priority doesn't mean it's an explosion or a kind of predominance. It means that there is a principle that is active, another principle that is receptive, and matter is always receptive of the act of the form. In that sense, soul is always the director principle of the whole living being in its structure and its dynamism. A conclusion or a consequence from this is that the soul is present in the whole living being. It's not only a part of it, it's present in everything. Well, if we bring this to human being, not only as in general animals or plants, but you bring this to human beings, the conclusion is that the rational soul, that is the director principle of the whole human being, is present in all the dimensions of the human being. And that means that also is present in the body, in many aspects of the body, structure of the body, the movements of the body. Well, Aristotle focuses on that very much when he thinks, for instance, that the body manifests rationality in its actions, like, for instance, language, for instance, the erect position of the spine, the use of hands, what is well known, the idea of a face. Well, those things are really a manifestation of the soul, the rational soul in the structure of the body. Well, in the case of habits is also a consequence of this. A habit is a presence of rational soul in human action. That means that I can control my actions from my rationality. And that action is not only a spiritual action, it's also an action that is reflected in the movements of my body. And that's why we can speak also about habits in the body, even if it is not the main meaning of habit, is not the main dimension of habit, but we can analyze also habit on the part of the body. It's sure that Aristotle didn't pay much attention to the brain. He paid more attention to the heart, the biology of his time. But nevertheless, it is clear that for him, habits also are reflected in our body. Well, the conclusion of this is the priority of form upon matter and act upon potency. And that means that soul is not separated from body, but nevertheless is the main motor and principle of a structure of the body. The final idea about Aristotle I wanted to underline is the distinction of two kinds of action for Aristotle. It's also well known, but Aristotle distinguishes between praxis and poiesis. And that means that praxis is the action that doesn't have an outcome outside the subject or the agent, while poiesis is productive of something external. Praxis is an action that has the end or the goal of that action within itself. It is accomplished only in the process of making that action without producing anything different. In the case of poiesis, it's the other way around. It's something external, and the action is perfectionated, finished, only when something external is produced. Well, if I underline this, is because at the end, habit, that is a kind of activity, is not a process, because a habit is something stable. It's not an operation, but nevertheless, it's an act for Aristotle. It's a perfection. And it's a perfection that belongs to the idea of the sphere of praxis, because habit is perfectionating human agent by itself, not by the product that it gives act, outside the agent. But habit is a kind of praxis at the end. Well, this is more or less a kind of very, very, very narrow and very, very simplified sketch of the idea of habit in Aristotle. And I want to just underline the idea of disposition as the idea of possessing or controlling the action, and at the same time of becoming something inside through that possession, that kind of activity, and at the same time keeping that being throughout time. Let us pass just to describe very in a very summary way the idea of habit in American pragmatism. Well, as you know, American pragmatism is a very complex movement and had several authors. I will focus mostly on the founders, so to say, of this school, who are Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. A general characterization of habit, American pragmatism, is that they consider human being as a whole. That they share that idea also with Aristotle, the idea of that human being is a unity, and we cannot separate parts within it, only dimensions, but not really parts. It's a kind of holism. The difference between them and Aristotle is this idea of the unity of human being, is that they consider human being mostly as something natural. So to say, they have a naturalistic approach to human being. Human being is nothing else than the very developed animal, and at the end, that is a very developed physical being, biological being, so to say. It doesn't have a spirit. No? So there is not an idea of a form or something immaterial within human being, but at the same time, it's something unitarian, something complete. The other thing related as a general trait of habit in American pragmatism is the idea that habit is something physical. Human being, for sure, possesses habits, participates in habits, but nevertheless, habit is something that goes beyond human being. It's something that belongs to nature, and the habits are present in nature as a kind of physical law of nature, and as applied to human beings, specifically to our psychology, we discover our capability of keeping our actions through habits as a kind of manifestation of something physical within us. Well, let us see just specifically the position of those three authors in a very simplified way. First of all, Charles Sanders Peirce was the first one to focus on habits. For him, habit was a very central idea of pragmatism, and he approached it from two main points of view, the psychological and the physical one. And from the psychological point of view, he thought that habit is a kind of mediator between our beliefs and our actions. It is convenient for us to have beliefs, and it's necessary. We are continuously making claims about reality, and this is what we believe. But in order for us to pass to action, we need to make a bridge, and that bridge is the habit. We cannot apply what we believe on action without habits. So at the end, habits are like a methodology or a way to pass from thought to action in a very stable way. Nevertheless, he also focused on a physical approach to habit, and he considered it to be a universal force of nature. So something that at the end is present in human being, but it belongs to the whole nature. In second place, William James. Now, when William James' habit is already a central point of his thought. Really, he can be considered a philosopher of habit. And he has a very holistic vision. He again applies this idea of physical force that is universal to human being. And he considers habits to be an inner harmonizer of our energies. We need a kind of balance of all the energies that we have, and that balance is the habit. It's a kind of global mediator of our experience, we can say. From this point of view, he assigned two dimensions to habits. The first one was automatism, and the second was plasticity. They are very self-explanatory, but just to understand that automatism for him was an expression of the necessity of economizing the subject's effort. At the end, they are also utilitarian, and they think that we need to optimize the effort we apply in our action. So the way to do so, the regulator of that energy that we apply to action is always the habit. On the other side, plasticity is also characteristic of habit. We can always modify habits. But being something physical, and this is very interesting, again, different from Aristotle, being something physical, the plasticity of habit is something decreasing, continuously decreasing. Why? Because the more we apply habit to some kind of action, the more we are already like crystallized in some kind of typology or way of acting. So plasticity is something that tends to decrease throughout time. In the third place, John Dewey, that is the most modern of them, and he has really a very systematic approach to habits. It can be considered like the apex of the original American pragmatism. And well, he thinks that human being is mostly a creature of habit. We are a habit, or a kind of a monk or a bundle of habits. And he considers habit to be something also organic, but not only organic because it is physical, but also because it is a harmonizer not only of individual experience, but also of our relation with the environment. We need continuously to adapt to the environment. And the way to do so is always through habits. It's a kind of synchronization between the individual and the environment. So it's a mediator not only within the human agent, but also between the individual and the environment, and also between individual and society, so the action of other agents. Let us approach already to a synthesis of those thinkers and finally to propose some conclusions. As a synthesis of them, we can underline the idea of the holistic approach of all of them, but mostly from a naturalistic perspective. They don't think that a human being is spiritual, so there is not an inner modification from the spiritual point of view, but only a physical point of view. Well, a habit is something that is physical within us, but at the same time, it has a social outcome. So a relation with the environment, so the natural environment, but also with the social environment, as is continuously regulating our relation with others. They think that habit is something plastic, so it can be modified, but at the same time, that plasticity is limited. And through this kind of holistic approach to habits, they want to dissolve the problem of the opposition within the idea of habit between control or freedom and determinism, stability or fixation, right? That, by the way, was also something present in Aristotle. And I think it's one of the main, so to say, the crucial and the most critical aspects of the idea of habit, to the idea of controlling our behavior through habit and nevertheless fixing our behavior through habit. Well, they want just to dissolve the problem, making habit something physical. Let us approach now some conclusions. We may think that American pragmatism and Aristotle are very similar in their approach, and to some extent they are, in the sense that they want to achieve a unitary approach to human being. But the idea that they are naturalistic and at the end they tend to consider human being only something biological is very reductive for them. So they cannot agree with Aristotle in the idea that the habit is something that is modifying my behavior only or mostly as something of my spiritual dimension, so to say, that nevertheless has an outcome on my body, but is something that begins and is controlled by my spiritual dimension. In that sense, the idea of fixation that we can find in Aristotle is mostly the idea of stability, a kind, as we were mentioning before in the relation before, the idea that we can keep our behavior throughout time, because at the end we are living a life that is a whole. It is a whole. It's the same living being throughout time. For American pragmatism, the idea of stability is mostly an idea of fixation, and that's why at the end plasticity is decreasing throughout time. So, and I think, and this is my last idea, that what is behind the approaches of Aristotle and pragmatists is the idea of the end or goal of human life. So the idea of telos. For Aristotle, the idea of the telos of human life is the fulfillment of human being as something and somebody who is rational. So at the end is rationality that is growing in us and is like ordering, putting order and organizing the whole being. And I can be considered accomplished, but all my life has been rationally ordered through the main principle that is the intellect. Instead, for American pragmatism, the idea of fulfillment for human being is the idea of well-being. It's something like only stability. So not having other elements which can at the end modify my behavior, but I continuously try to keep a balance, right? But there is not a kind of, so to say, a transcendent approach to the idea of the end or fulfillment of human life. Well, with this, I will finish, and I will be happy eventually to establish a dialogue with you. Thank you very much.